Now I'd like to make a video about a book slash an idea that I shouldn't have to make a video about, but unfortunately society is not where it needs to be, and that is addressing some issues with the USSR. Now, I'm happy to say that the USSR is not widely considered a a great country. It's finally getting some of the contempt that the Nazis got. It deserves obviously even more contempt than the Nazis got. So it's not there yet, but it's not. There aren't as many apologists as perhaps there once were. However, there's still some. You still see people who say, well, maybe Stalin went too far or didn't handle things just right, but there is some value there. And I'll never forget, I saw a lecture by Michael Parenti, who I believe is a Harvard professor, saying, "Hey, they got a lot of things right. Maybe we should look at their system because it seems to have been able to do certain things." And he cited raising the literacy rate, which I suppose if you murder tens of millions of illiterate peasants, yes, the illiteracy rate may actually improve. But there's a number of good books people can turn to. One, Behind the Urals. This is made by a sympathetic Marxist, or at least a socialist from the United States, who moved to the Soviet Union in the 30s and worked at Magnitogorsk, which was a huge iron mountain that they tried to turn into a iron smelting works. He's sympathetic, but he also is not blind. He talks about many of the problems, and it's amazing that he'll say how great socialism is, but at almost every page he explicitly admits that the poorest person in America has it 100 times better than the richest person in the USSR. Uh, so that's a pretty good read. Obviously a no-brainer. The Gulag Archipelago. This stuff is hard to read. There's 7 parts. This is only the first 2. I got the other 2 back there. Uh, he's a good writer. He's got a lot of wit, Solzhenitsyn, but it's hard. I mean, to read about all the gory details, uh, but it's really sobering. But Parenti and the other socialists and liberals, if that's even a good word in this society, will typically acknowledge those failings, but they'll say, but in certain aspects, it had certain achievements, certain technological breakthroughs. And so that brings me to probably by far the least known. This book is a rare book. Very few people have read this book, but it's an extremely important book. And that is Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. It's 3 volumes long. This is the first volume. It's chronological, so this goes from 1917 to 1930. The next one goes from 1930 to the end of World War II, and then there's another one that goes from the end of World War II to the 1970, I believe. And they're extremely hard to find. If you go on Amazon, they're either not available or each copy individually is running into the many hundreds or even the thousands of dollars. I've seen just one volume being $1,500. I started looking for them maybe almost 9 years ago, and I would basically check Amazon every week or so. And I was eventually able to get this one was, I think I got this for $80, and I got volume 2 for $100, and a couple of years later, and volume 3 I could never find. I actually looked at the university library. My university library had, I think, 18 million texts, and they did not have it, but they were able to borrow it from another library for a week. And I took it to Staples and I photocopied the whole thing, which is a lot cheaper than trying to buy it. And I heard about this book from a radio host named Stanley Monteith. He's one of the big conspiracy theorists out there, but he is very well sourced. I was never really a frequent listener to his show, but if you even listen to 1 hour, he will probably recommend at least a dozen books, if not more. So you have to listen with a pen and paper. And the few I listened to, I would buy those books, and they were all well worth it. And he always talks about this one. It's published by the Hoover Institute back in the 70s. There was only ever 1 printing, and there's not a big population of people who understand its significance, but that population is still bigger than the actual number of copies, so they're very hard to find. if you can get it from a library, it's kind of dry, but it's absolutely iconoclastic. Unbelievable. He did not exaggerate the importance of this book. Basically, what the author does is he systematically goes through just about every piece of technology that could possibly be attributed to the Soviet Union, be it machine guns, boilers, even engines, nuclear weapons, everything. Every industry, the oil industry, the mining industry, the lumber industry, even the fur industry, everything. And he documents uh, that all of that technology has its origins and was developed in the West. That there was literally nothing that was invented in the Soviet Union. And it's all triple sourced. He will source it with a Western source, usually the company that had an agreement with the Soviet Union, like Ford. Then he'll usually have a source from some consulate in Eastern Europe, say Estonia, where workers for that firm went to Russia. And then he'll even have Soviet sources. So Pravda, or one of them, they had many trade journals who would even admit, oh, we'd like to proudly announce this brand new equipment given to us by the Ford Motor Company. So it's kind of boring. You go through and just chapter by chapter, he goes through all the industries, but he shows how everything in the Soviet Union either came from the West or came from Tsarist period. There was actually industry in Russia prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, but the Bolshevik Revolution basically ended all of that. He makes a point to describe, for instance, there was this isn't that unknown, there was actually a relative to the time, a very thriving aviation industry in pre-Soviet Russia. And that was completely annihilated. They didn't invent any more new planes after that, or any more aviation technology. All of it was imported from the West after that. There was also an automobile industry, not comparable to that in the United States, but of course the one in the United States was by far the most innovative in the world, but it was very good. That ceased. They didn't produce another car until after World War II, and those were actually produced in factories built by Ford's architect. So Gorky's, the Gorky plant, a famous huge truck plant, was built by the Ford Motor Company. If you read Solzhenitsyn, he actually talks about some of the factories he had to build as a slave laborer. They would always talk about, oh, well, this is a copy of some steel mill in South Bend, Indiana, or Gary, Indiana. And I'd always heard that the Soviets stole technology, like the atom bomb, and of course they did, but that was a tiny fraction. Most of what they got through agreements with Western companies and with Western governments. They would go and they would say, they would go to say Standard Oil, and they'd say, well, we have all this oil in the Caucasus. If you come and develop the fields, you'll get profit from it. And they would agree to this. They'd build the oil wells. They would train Russian workers, which was usually in the agreement that they'd have to train Russian workers. And once the Russians figured that they had enough Russian workers who knew how to do it, they would basically renege on the contract and kick out the Westerners. However, that would mean that the industry would be frozen at that level, and so 10 years later they'd realize, okay, our oil industry is the same place it was at when we kicked Standard Oil out, so now we need a new agreement with somebody else to bring it up to snuff. And that's basically what they did the entire time. And this is for everything, even technically easy things like furniture and chalk. And so to go to Michael Parenti's retarded point that, oh, they increased education. Yeah, well, in the classrooms of the Soviet Union, all the chairs, all the chalkboards, all the electricity, all of that was built and maintained and copied from Western standards. None of that was Soviet. The Soviet, and there are actually Soviet writers who would admit this, that they would say capitalism is pregnant with future technologies. And socialism is, of course, not. And they had a big problem right after the revolution where they had all these factories and they didn't even know how to run them. So they would go and what they would do is they would their phrase for it was to keep them in uh, what was this term? They just keep them. They basically mothball them until they could figure out how to make them work, which was usually never. Uh, so it's really, I mean, it's boring because there's no, he doesn't really do a thesis. He doesn't say, well, this is why socialism doesn't work. Normally in a book like this, yeah, I would have thought that, you know, he would have just spent the whole time railing against the USSR and then given 2 or 3 examples. But the whole book is examples. Just example, industry by industry. He even goes to the different kinds of tractors. I mean, that's a funny story. Like they couldn't build any tractors. They certainly couldn't design any tractors. They tried to copy some Ford tractors, the Fordsums, and they couldn't do it. The tractors that they attempted to build in the Soviet Union, they bought some Ford tractors and they tried to reverse engineer them and they failed. And then they uh, paid Ford to build a factory to build the tractors, which he did. And then they tried to manufacture those tractors, and they manufactured them at double the cost it would have cost for them to buy. And they were so horrible that they would all break down within about a week of service. Most of them would break down so much that they could never be used for anything. Approximately 10% they could take off the wheels and use them to generate electricity. And that's the best they could do on a copy of a Ford tractor. And he even goes into say, well, it might be alleged that maybe Russians are just naturally stupid or something like that. And he goes, obviously that's not the case. He goes through some studies and says, well, technically, in certain things like IQ, actually Russians tend to, on average, be higher than just about anybody else, at least Western Europeans who they're competing with. And so that's obviously not the case. He even goes into some examples of the Tsarist industry and how there was actually a lot of innovation there. He uses the example of during World War I, Western European advisors to the Russian army sent back reports saying, well, the Russians have their own version of a gas mask, which is completely different technology than what we use. It's not a copy. It's completely original and apparently effective, at least as effective as the Western standards. So they had their own industry, and socialism managed to completely destroy it. And maintain and over the years, the type of agreements they made did change. Uh, Eventually, they got away from Western firms coming to Russia and building factories to where they would just sign technical agreements where they'd either pay a lot of money or they would pay in resources and import, plans, technical manuals, that sort of thing. He said it's also one of the most interesting factors. He said if you looked at the exports of the USSR, and I think he uses the year 1970, the chief export was oil, and the next biggest one was either lumber or furs. I think that was 2 and 3. He said it's interesting. There are no they didn't export any manufactured goods at all, as opposed to a country like the United States, where there's I think automobiles are #1, also all kinds of computers and God knows what else. And if you just look, the fact that we would call it a superpower, but its exports were reflective of a third world country that has a lot of resources but isn't able to really produce anything. And that's exactly correct. Nothing they could produce was worth anything. If they did produce something, it was at high cost. It was at low quality to the point where it couldn't even be sold. And even the stuff that they produced was a copy of Western things. So it needs to be said, there's nothing really redeeming at all in the Soviet Union. It's just a whole bunch of unnecessary genocide, basically, of the worst type. Which I shouldn't even have to say it, but apparently there are still a lot of people who think it has some kind of redeeming quality that we should examine to emulate in some way, and that's just disgusting. So.